The Art of Survival, next on Carpe Diem.
Carpe Diem is funded in part by The Record and the Herald News.
Her Space is a comprehensive breast imaging facility. It's the realization of my dream of what a state-of-the-art, compassionate breast imaging facility should be for women. And we are committed to making the breast imaging experience not only expeditious for patients, but less anxiety producing. I've been practicing breast imaging for about 15 years now. I would say in those 15 years, there's not been a single working day that has gone by that I haven't told one woman or another that she has breast cancer. It's a national health crisis, and I've had a front row seat to the tragedy that presents to not only the patient but all of her loved ones. And I know that I've committed my professional career to try to improve the survival of women with breast cancer. But I wanted to also do something philanthropic, raise money for breast cancer research. I've also always loved art, and I'm very well aware of the power that art has to bring people together, to make them pause and think, to feel. So there was just this idea in my head that we could possibly use the arts to bring women and men together to both honor women with breast cancer, to raise public awareness of it, and just kind of to create a community spirit.
I went for a routine mammogram in November of 2002, and they saw calcifications on my films, and they sent me to see Dr. Deutsch at Her Space.
Nancy was a patient of mine. She's a breast cancer survivor.
By the summertime, I was going through the reconstruction process, but I was doing great, and I had a body of work now.
I got an invitation from her to come and see one of her art exhibits in Red Bank, and her art at that time, what she was showing was very much related to her breast cancer experience.
I could just tell that this was a woman that valued and appreciated art, and so I wanted her to see it. And afterwards, she told me how touched she was by the work. And I said to her, what I would really love is to be able to show the whole body of work, because I was in a group show and I only had a few pieces.
So I ran by her this idea that was brewing in my mind about doing the Art of Survival, and she seemed very excited about it.
And I said, well, please count me in. A couple months later, I got an invitation to join her in Red Bank at a restaurant with some people that are on her staff. So we all met for dinner, and we decided, we were talking about how we see this coming about and how we were going to find the artists. And I said, I'd like to do that.
She just had a tremendous network, and so she offered to help me find the artists, because that was one big obstacle for me, and kind of just took off from there. When I was starting to implement the event, which was about 1 year into Her Space, a friend of mine and a former patient of mine lost her battle with breast cancer, and her name was Deanie Goldsmith. I remember sitting at her memorial service at that time, just thinking if I could honor her in some way in particular in the course of this event, it would be a great thing. And it turns out that Deanie was a beautiful artist.
I teach for the Monmouth County Park System in Lincroft. At the time, though, I taught in Tatum Park in Middletown, and friends of mine brought Deanie to my class. When she first came into class, she was extremely intense and wanted to learn everything really quickly. She didn't know anything about painting. I didn't think she did. I started her from scratch. As she got better and better, she would do more and more paintings. She got looser, her paintings got larger, and she was a very generous person, so her paintings had that kind of generosity of spirit. She began to do a series of paintings on her own, and they almost always focused on people who were close to her.
She started painting She originally did little landscapes, and I don't think that appealed to her. I don't think she wanted something much more. She did nudes of her family. She did several of her daughter pregnant. She did her sister-in-law.
To her, people were profoundly interesting. Just, it's part of the sense of wonder that she carried around, walking up to them and starting conversations. And then she would say, "Oh, do you mind if I take a picture of you?" And then that picture would stay with her and she would think about it. And then one day that picture would turn into a painting. And there was an exuberance to her painting. As somebody said, she had a hard time fitting her people on the canvases. No matter how big her canvas was, the heads would always sort of, or the hands or something would always go off. So she was big-hearted and big-spirited, and it showed in her paintings. What she really did was she captured people's souls and also her relationship with them. She made people feel good about themselves, almost always.
She was a very magnanimous person. She had just an incredible heart. She could sense what it was that you needed to encourage you to become greater than you were. I don't know how to explain that exactly, but she had a sense, an intuitive sense of what you needed to expand your horizons or realize your dreams.
The amazing thing about her is that she did help. She helped a lot of people who needed help and a lot of causes. To the very end, she came to class. She was very optimistic, and I kept thinking, because I'm pretty optimistic, that you know that something great would happen, that she would get better and things would get better, but it ended up it didn't.
She was diagnosed with breast cancer. She went through various treatments and thought it was gone. She and I were biking in Scotland. Once we took that trip because she had Scottish ancestors, and before she died, she wanted to go to Scotland. But while we were there, she wasn't feeling terribly well, and when she came back, and it turned out to be metastasized. She never gave way. I remember seeing this in a journal that she wrote, and she said, "I want this experience with cancer to be liberating. Now it's about abandonment, expression, loving and playing with myself, my family, my art, and however and whomever I can help along the way." And I read that and I thought that just really epitomizes, she didn't get down. She thought, okay, now this is the time to play, to do what I need to do, to help as many people as I can. And it's just, I think it says a lot about her.
So it just seemed like a very fitting tribute to her. So the first year, the Art of Survival, we dedicated to Deanie. It was shortly after her death. We had her entire family here. We had her art on display. And we approached the Goldsmith family and kind of came to agreement that it would be appropriate also to name the foundation after her. The very first event raised over $100,000, and it was very well attended. We had the opening, a big gala dinner in adjoining space. The art was set up at her space and actually ran for the month of October. We had gallery hours so that people could come to her space when we weren't seeing patients to see the art as well.
It was sold out. Over 300 people attended. It was just an incredible, incredible evening of people sharing and meeting. We had the chrysalis was screen printed onto these canvas panels, 12 inches by 12 inches. People could pay $25 and paint them that night. We had a breast cancer quilt on the wall made out of these canvases, whether it was in memory or honoring someone. It was just this incredible evening. When I spoke that night at the event, I really talked about the sisterhood of breast cancer survivors. It's not a sisterhood you really asked to join, but once you are, you're really embraced, and you find how many people are touched by breast cancer. Mothers, brothers, sisters, I mean, everyone knows, not just someone, knows lots.
We usually have about 12 to 15 artists each year. I've just been incredibly moved, not only with the art, but with the artists who've been there.
I'm a twin, a fraternal twin, and my twin sister got breast cancer, I think it was 1987. She did not have to have chemo, but she had a struggle. And then my very good friend, a very good childhood friend, got breast cancer as well. I mean, I know a lot of people, so it's impacted my life. When my sister got breast cancer, I did a whole series of paintings of people who've had breast cancers as well, and had mastectomies and then had rebuilt breasts, and that was what I put in the show. This series was called Keyhole Series, and some of which are titled Changes of Life. I created a whole series based on changes of life that come about without you being aware. Something can happen out of nowhere. I actually have a very good friend who says having a really serious illness, it kind of changes you. You become a much more passionate person. And she said in a funny way, it was like changed her whole psyche and changed her whole way of viewing the world, in that she feels a much richer person because of it. So it's a voyeuristic peek into the myriad physical and psychological upheavals that occur as we mature. And these are pretty large paintings. They're all 7 feet by 5 feet. And they're hung like banners. They're hung with grommets, like what they'd hang sails from. So they kind of move in the wind, and they can move. They're kind of not stretched tightly. This piece is entitled Keyhole Series Changes of Life, Nancy. And what I did is, keyhole meant looking into the past, and I have a silhouette of a figure, and then within that silhouette, I collaged in a very large photograph. Then I put threads around the edge, and the threads are a metaphor for being stitched up and for women's work. I juxtaposed the image of my student who lifted up her shirt, showed me her rebuilt breast, but they hadn't put the nipple in yet. And I put that into an image of an ivory statuette of the Virgin because of this whole metaphor and relationship to suffering and just the beauty also of a virgin from art history. And another one that was in the show was called Changes of Life. Sluter and my friend Susan, and Susan had rebuilt breast, but I juxtaposed her image with a painting by Klaus Sluter, and it was of also a mournful sculpture in art history. And I have the same silhouette of this woman, and I put a viola in because my friend Susan was a violist. So I always put these personal images in, and I have these butterflies in as well. People first are a little shocked to see the photographs. Some people, because of the photograph of these particularly, because there it is, there's a breast that doesn't have a nipple yet. Other people actually get upset. And I've done series where people have actually cried sometimes because they see things, and people relate to work according to their own experience. I think a painting has like a life of its own once it's done. Whatever I put into it, a painting also is on its own. Like I won't be there to tell people what it's about. But also I learned so much from how people respond to the painting. So it has like this third life. It's like I made it, it has a life of its own, and then it's this other life where I get this response from people. And it can be some things in a painting that I had no idea that I put in there. So I think that's great. To do these paintings, it makes me feel better because I'm scared, scared of breast cancer, scared of getting sick. At the same time, I have this empathy. And so for me, the best thing has always been is to paint, and everything I'm scared of, like dogs, I'll paint dogs in my paintings, and so that I'll kind of become more familiar with what I fear. And so that's almost all my work is based on what I'm passionately interested in. And I know that my twin sister, she's such a big influence, she doesn't realize that, but it really affected the way my art kind of turns and weaves around depending on what's going on in my life.
I knew I was going to be an artist from the time I was in grade school, and I attended music and art high school in Manhattan, and I went on to art school after and got a bachelor's of fine arts, and I've always known. I was a sculptor and a printmaker. I started using pastel 10 years ago. The pastel was a way to use color in a very immediate way and I really enjoy working on paper. I worked more realistically when I was younger, and then it got to the point where I've been there, done that, I don't need to do that anymore, it's not interesting to me. I find it more interesting to invent forms and try and change the way we see things, because I just find it's who I am. If I did realistic work, it wouldn't be me, it wouldn't feel right. My mother had breast cancer, and that's how this whole body of work came about. Well, I always do work that affects me personally, either something I'm going through or something that someone close to me is going through. And my work is always about the emotions in myself that come out while I'm doing the work. So when my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, I was very angry and, of course, very upset and scared and worried. And I tried to put that all into my work. And also, working when you're going through something like that keeps you from going crazy. The series is called the Victim Series, and I gave myself a set of criteria when I did the pieces. They were all to be full frontal standing women to give a sense of power. I also decided to limit the color palette. There's a lot of pinks and reds in there. The reds are there because it's a very powerful color. And pinks are a color that you don't normally associate with power. They're sort of a color you associate with women and babyish quality almost. And I thought that by using pink, it would be used in an entirely new way. The women represent my mother, but they also represent all women, and that's the reason they all have a sort of an anonymous face. This piece here is called Ghost Woman, and it's one of the first pieces I did. And you can see there's almost a primitive, innocent quality to it that started to change as my mother's diagnosis started to change. The pieces got angrier, the colors got more intense, more agitated, because that's the way I felt. I included the one man because it's called Spirit Figure. And it was done as a guardian piece to kind of watch over everybody and protect my mother almost. Once my mother passed away, that was it. I mean, after she died, I even did a few pieces that were actually ghosts, or spirits, or her spirit, just trying to keep it alive for a little longer. And then I just couldn't anymore. I had to move on to something else. It's just the way I can communicate to the world what I'm going through. I don't think I could live without it. I've been doing it my whole life.
This work is based on my body and the transformation that it went through, having been diagnosed and then surgery for breast cancer. My work is always a strong narrative about what's going on in my life. I've done work about crows when I returned back to New Jersey from Hawaii. I've done my surfing rabbit when I lived in Hawaii. I've done my neighbors. I've done my children when I became a mother. And this just seemed to be the next natural narrative of my life. So following my diagnosis, I happened to meet a woman at a workshop. And she and I started talking, and I told her that I was just diagnosed, and she said, well, don't take this wrong, but I'm a photographer, and if you want pictures, I'd be happy to take them of you. As life is very coincidental, just that day I'd bought some black and white film, and I was trying to think who of my friends would take pictures of me. So she and I had several sessions where she documented my body in black and white before surgery and then during the process of reconstruction. And those photographs became the basis of this work. I started taking these small black and white photos, cutting them up, collaging them into my journal, along with some writing. And some friends of mine who are artists saw the book, and they just said, Nancy, you have to do something with these. So some of these are the actual photos on the smaller level, but most of them then became scanned in, printed on Japanese papers, printed on handmade paper that I made. They became drawings, collages, monoprints, found objects, text, just to tell the story of my personal journey. My background is in printmaking. I did undergraduate at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and I was a drawing major, but that's when I took my first printmaking class. And I loved the process, and I loved how you could take different materials and evolve an image. I think that was really it. Not so much what the end product was going to be, but the process and where it would take you. And that's really what my experience was with recovering from breast cancer. It was really about the process. I didn't know really what the end was going to be, but it was going through each step, and each step would lead you to the next step. And that's what printmaking does. At one point I was reading a book called Generation J, and it was about a young woman who was brought up in a very secular Jewish home. Her parents were non-observant, and she was kind of on a quest to see how Judaism fit in her life. And it was an interesting parallel to my life, because I was brought up a conservative Jew, and this book kind of called out to me. And in it, she was talking about this quest, and she mentioned this term wayfinding, about mapping an identity. And I realized that that's really what I was doing in terms of my art. By working this process again, it really became more about who I was. So the more that your work becomes personal, it also becomes more universal. People can respond to it. I think the process of making art for me is really about finding out who you are. The process of making art also is very similar to the process of my cancer, in that it's a journey. It's painful at times. It's all about birth and rebirth. And it's kind of like who I was before is very different than who I am now, physically and spiritually. And the art is the vehicle that takes me through this process.
Let our histories then be a gate unfastened to a new life, not a barrier to our becoming. That's a poem by David White. My story is that I was always kind of a healthnik, and so when I didn't feel well one spring, I thought I had Lyme disease, and I passed out while I was driving the car. I went through the windshield of the car, flipped the car over, and when I got out of the trauma center, they found nothing wrong, although I looked like this. I went to my internist, and he found a lump in my breast. The impact of the seatbelt brought out the little tumor that was in my breast. But it was in a place that wouldn't have been found and wasn't found on mammograms. So that was an unlikely surprise present, so to speak. I decided to have a mastectomy and chemotherapy. My family was very supportive. My younger daughter, my older daughter, they both took care. My husband was as frightened as I was at the moment. My mom was there to support me as well. I started studying and photographing around 1980, and I immediately went into exploring family life and emotions. And every time I wanted to explore something, I photographed it. And that was my way, because for me, photographing got me into the feelings, and that's what I always want. I always want to explore the unconscious, no matter how much fear is involved. This is the night before surgery, and as you can see, I'm in shock. Not the way I was feeling. I was fortunate enough in the middle of all this to get into the Otto Art Colony for 6 weeks. And that is a place where you get a studio and they cook for you, and all you need to do is work. It's the most wonderful opportunity. And so that photograph that I showed you of the night before surgery, where I looked frozen, I was really able to, at Yaddo, express how I felt that night before surgery. I call this the scream or sacrifice. 2. My husband came to visit at Yaddo, and we worked. That was a dream he had, that he was holding me and supporting me, and so we made that photograph. And this is a very important photograph because he was so supportive. I understand not all husbands are. So I worked and worked and knew that things were going to be fine. And so this is one of the photographs of rising above it all, getting through it, becoming a different person in many ways, looking at life in a different way, learning to love life, becoming spiritual. At the Art of Survival, everybody was very moved. People call me all the time to find out about my experience, to get advice, and actually a couple of women who were in the middle of chemotherapy wanted to be photographed so that they would remember that time. And so it's nice. I like to be able to do that.
We're going to do another art show. It's the month of October. This year, I think we're going to try to launch Nancy's book.
One thing that we would like to have is the launch of a book called Butterfly Kisses and Wishes on Wings, helping a child journey through a loved one's cancer. When I was first diagnosed, a cousin of mine who lives in Colorado called me and said, you know, how are you? What can I do? And I said, Ellen, I just don't know how I'm going to tell my children. At the time, my two little boys, Griffin was 5 and Nate was 3. And I knew that Ellen also has 2 little boys, but she also had worked with children for over 25 years, special ed, early childhood education. A week later, I got this email from her and said, Nancy, I was so touched by what you had said to me. I think she literally dreamed the book. I think she went to bed, came up with this idea, and wrote this book for me. It tells a child about what is cancer, but really things that a young child would think of, which is, how is it going to affect me? Is it contagious? And their feelings. Did I cause it? But it is really about empowering them, like, how can we help? You know, I can cover mommy's toes if she's chilly. I can read to her. I can play with my brother quietly. And Ellen seemed to touch on all of this. She really had a sense of this. And at the time she said, well, maybe you'll illustrate it for me. And I said, I'm not really an illustrator. I mean, here I'm doing all these images of my body, and, you know, I just didn't see myself doing something that might appeal to a young child. And 2 years went by, and we revisited the project, and she said, I really hope you'll reconsider. And I've reconsidered, and I've been doing the drawings. We have a beautiful book, and we hope to release it at the Art of Survival this year.
It's a magnificent book, and I think it could help a lot of women. And I said, maybe there's a role for the foundation to help you in that. It is certainly within our mission in terms of community awareness and education. So I would like to use the next Art of Survival to help her, so to speak, launch that book and let the community, you know, become aware of its presence.